Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am indie author Nicole Callihan and I am doing an ASMR reading of my newest release, Lies, Love, Death, Fate. And today I'm going to read the entire first chapter. So let's get started. Chapter 1, White Room, Red Jacket. The waiting room, white and sterile, could be adequately described as a closet. No windows, one door. Walls molded from seamless plastic. Smooth surfaces glowing with golden light that didn't cast shadows. It was meant to feel warm, comforting. It failed. A small, round, white table bloomed like a mushroom from the center of the room. Twin, high-backed wooden chairs flanked it, transplanted from somewhere else. Somewhere normal. Genesis sat draped in an itchy gray-green blanket that smelled old, musty. She clutched it closed with one hand, its warmth comforting, as she tried to focus on the chair. Real, solid. But her eyes kept dragging back to the walls. They weren't blank. Not really. At first she thought they were. Smooth, featureless, manufactured. But the longer she looked, the more she was sure she saw something slither beneath. Not shapes. Not exactly. More like tendrils of shadow. She sucked in a lungful of air, holding it until they burned. The air was dry, her throat was raw. She coughed, pulling the blanket tighter, shivering. It wasn't cold. She was hallucinating. She had to be. Her eyes flickered back to the walls, smooth, white. Nothing. "How long does shock last?" she muttered, her foot bobbing up and down. She spoke just to hear something, proving she was still there. Dispel the creeping madness. Her voice felt too loud in the silence, but it didn't echo, didn't settle. It just stopped. The uniformed woman who had brought her up from the vehicle had been brisk, impatient, a functionary. Genesis had asked where they were going. "There," the woman had said, without looking at her, as if the destination was irrelevant, as if Genesis was irrelevant. The door had opened. She'd stepped inside. The door had shut. Then she was alone again. She was used to being alone. At first, she'd tried counting the seconds, tracking the rhythm of her breathing, but time was slippery, featureless. Minutes stretched, folded, dissolved. She had never had a good grip on time before, losing days, weeks sometimes, pieces of her life chiseled away, lost, forgotten. She shifted in her chair. The movement felt distant, disconnected from her body. Her thumbnail dug absently into the pad of her finger. "I'm sure it's only been 5 minutes," she said. Then, "How long does it take to starve? 3 days? 3 weeks? Would they leave me here that long?" A flicker, subtle, almost imperceptible, a tiny rupture in the periphery of her vision. The table, the chairs, the floor, the walls, something shifted. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. She just watched, waiting for it to happen again, hoping it wouldn't. "Go away," she whispered. Then, a seam, as if activated by her words, thin, almost invisible. A hairline fracture in the pristine white wall snaking from floor to ceiling. Had it been there before? It hadn't. Her right hand tightened around the blanket, knuckles white. She leaned forward, breath shallow, watching, willing herself to remain silent, fingers over her lips. Afraid it would fracture further, she spoke again. She didn't look away this time. The seam widened. Not much, not at first. Then the wall fluttered beneath it, inward. Darkness. A thick, suffocating darkness. Slowly her eyes adjusted and she could see silhouettes, restless, looming, waiting. The world beyond stretched deep, infinite. This isn't real. The seam trembled, alive, a heartbeat, then snapped shut. Genesis flinched, withdrawing further into the blanket. She wanted to scream, but she was afraid it would break further and swallow her. A tentative breath. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3. The waiting room was solid again, seamless. She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them. Still the same, still pristine, still a closet. It was shock, a hallucination, fatigue and fear, a nightmare stalking her. Was she awake? Was this a dream? She pinched her arm. Ouch. Awake? But had she imagined it? Hadn't she? Before she could decide, the door hissed open. Genesis jerked her head, snapping toward the stranger. A woman, tall and severe, stepped inside. The sharp click, click, click of her heels cut through the silence. A metronome, each step precise, measured, controlled. Her hair, red as fresh blood, was pulled into a sleek ponytail. Dark, angular glasses perched on her nose, framing eyes that cut through the room with clinical efficiency. She was flawless, deliberate, sharp as the edge of a scalpel. The woman crossed the room. The door hissed closed behind her, red leather jacket catching the artificial glow of the walls. Genesis knew her. A memory rose, smoke, heat, the taste of ash clogging her throat, poison curling through her veins, pain, agony. It had been burning. Everything was burning. She was trapped, dying, waiting to die. There's a girl alive down here. She could still hear the woman's voice clear through the chaos, dragging her back from the brink. Reynolds, Taylor, get down here now. One of them has survived. Bring bolt cutters. The paramedics this morning had called it a miracle, a statistical impossibility, a fluke. They spoke about it as if Genesis had slipped through the fingers of fate last night. Now, standing before her, Cassandra looked anything but a savior. You look exhausted, the woman observed, her words like static. Genesis could feel them dancing across her skin. She barely spoke, quieter than the night before, almost a whisper, distracted. Understandable. Genesis swallowed, feeling the weight of her own fatigue suddenly pressing down on her, smothering, suffocating. She didn't like the way Cassandra was looking at her. It wasn't concern or empathy. It was scrutiny. Because I'm disgusting, frying, fracturing. Her eyes flicked to the wall. Cassandra placed a paper cup on the table, just slightly closer to Genesis than the center. Just one. Genesis stared at the curling steam, the warm, bitter scent of coffee filling the small space like grasping tendrils. Hold it together. The moment stretched uncomfortably. Cassandra didn't gesture toward the chair, didn't ask permission. She simply dragged the chair back slowly, deliberate, then shrugged off her jacket, draping it carefully over the chair, then smoothed her skirt and sat. Every inch of her was curated, efficient, precise, poised. Genesis fought the urge to squirm as a nagging realization gripped her. She was painfully out of place, astray, scooped from filth. Cassandra's red lips curved. Not a smile. Exactly. No. Something grim. I assume my team managed to find clothes for you? Genesis nodded once, barely moving. Good. Silence. Genesis hesitated, then reached for the coffee. She half expected that she would stop her. She didn't. The cup was warm against her fingers, a simple, real thing in a room that felt fabricated. Her eyes glanced back to the wall, checking. Solid. She lifted it to her lips, took a cautious sip. Bitter. Her face twisted slightly. Cassandra noticed. Her lips pursed in amusement. Not to your taste? Her brow arched in question. Genesis set the cup down. She didn't answer. Cassandra folded her hands atop the table, her gaze never leaving Genesis. The pause stretched longer. Longer. Genesis's fingers twitched. You shouldn't exist. The words landed without emotion, sharp, stinging, a fact. But you needn't concern yourself. A quick dismissal of an uncomfortable revelation. I am standing in the way of your execution. For the moment. Genesis's skin prickled. Cassandra hadn't hesitated, hadn't flinched from the word, her voice casual, like she was discussing weather. You should be grateful, really, she continued, tilting her head, watching her. But gratitude is an advanced emotion, isn't it? I imagine you're more concerned with survival. Was she expected to say something in response? Cry? Beg? Demand answers? No. Don't dwell on it. She was alive. If she was supposed to be dead, then she would be dead. Just words. Just words. Are you stupid? Cassandra's accusation was quick, demanding. Genesis felt herself flinch. She had wanted an answer. She was angry now, agitated. Can you tell me at least who you are? The words slithered through the air, cruel, impatient. Genesis' fingers curled tighter around the blanket, a shield, a barrier, but the question sank in anyway, hooking beneath her ribs and twisting. Who was she? Her voice caught. She should know the answer, shouldn't she? Shouldn't it be easy? But no one had ever said who she was, why she was. The numbers on her wrist flashed through her mind, the sterile lab walls, the cold instruments, being watched, always watched like a caterpillar. Subject 03212085. No history, no roots, no real beginning, just a number, a body. I don't know. The admission tasted bitter. Cassandra didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched. Eyes dark and unreadable, then tap, tap, tap. Her fingernails drummed against the table. Genesis swallowed. Do you understand the question? I understand, she muttered, embarrassed. Can you give me any answer? The number sat heavy on her tongue, but rolled easily from her lips. Subject 03212085. She recited them without thought. Cassandra didn't react, not at first. Tap, tap, tap. A number, she mused. I see. Genesis felt her shoulders tighten. What does that number represent? My viability date. A quick answer. She wasn't stupid. Cassandra's brow lifted. Your birthday. Genesis barely restrained a scoff. No, not my birthday. My viability date. Behind the weight of those words was quiet resignation. She knew the truth. Should she have lied? Likely Cassandra already knew, and she was testing, picking. There are no mothers, no fathers, just genetic donors. The words left her mouth, hollow. Screens, teachers, tests, things to stave off boredom when I was awake. Nothing real, all of it fabricated. Cassandra considered her not sympathetic, not surprised, just interested. A scientist observing a specimen. Genesis dropped her gaze, her stomach twisting. She should have expected this, but she hadn't. For a fleeting moment she had thought she had been rescued. Could have been more than a subject. Tap, tap, tap. Cassandra's nails filled the silence, demanding attention. It was annoying. And is there something else you're called? Cassandra asked. Genesis hesitated. Gen 3. Cassandra repeated it. Gen 3. Clinical, detached. An entry in a file. Is that what you prefer? The question prickled beneath Genesis's skin. Prefer? That they call me that. Cassandra watched her. That cold, assessing gaze. Well, Cassandra said, leaning back, I'd like to call you something more appropriate. A name. A chill crawled down Genesis's spine. Appropriate? She didn't like it, so she forced a hollow laugh. It's just a name. She convinced herself that was true years ago, but saying it out loud for the first time shattered the fragile lie. Names have power, subject 0321. Cassandra's voice trailed, and she shook her head, as if to make a point. And power shapes identity. She spoke as if she were reciting a universal truth. Genesis felt it in her bones. Truth. She felt it in the way that the number wasn't a name, in the way that Gen 3 had never belonged to her either. A crude stand-in, in the way she had been something before this moment, before the lab, before... No. Stop. Then I guess I'm just a number, huh? Her voice was sharp, bitter. Cassandra smiled, just barely. It wasn't kind. It wasn't warm. It was tolerant. If that's what you believe, then yes, that is your reality. The words settled over her, a quiet, insidious Wait. Genesis swallowed, considering her words. She felt exposed, seen, and she didn't like it. There was a name. Fine, she relented. A secret, the name she called herself, alone in her mind. I'm Genesis, she said, admitting something she had never dared. Just Genesis. Very good, Genesis. Cassandra nodded, slow and deliberate, turning the name over, testing its weight, testing her. Genesis clenched her jaw, but she didn't look away. Didn't like the way it sounded spoken, like Cassandra had taken something. Cassandra, satisfied, folded her hands neatly atop the table, waiting. The silence stretched. And what am I? Genesis asked at last, the question creeping out, reluctant but inevitable. Cassandra tilted her head slightly, as if considering the answer. Then, softly, like an afterthought, the words fell from her lips. Advitus magus, Dryaldius tesca, tuantha dedanen. Genesis blinked. The words settled onto the air between them, unfamiliar but thick with meaning, ancient, weighted. She thought it would bring clarity. It brought more confusion. What does that mean? She asked, her voice hushed. Cassandra exhaled, slow and measured, adjusting the cuffs of her jacket before replying. The slightest delay. A calculation. It means, she said, pausing, eyes gleaming behind her glasses as she watched the confusion grow to dread. You are genetically spliced being, inhuman, unnatural. Genesis stilled. The words landed like a lead weight in her stomach. You shouldn't exist, Cassandra repeated. Genesis' breath left her in a slow, controlled exhale, suffocating. She was suffocating. Hearing it again made it feel more real, a reminder of a truth she had tried to ignore. They tried to terminate me, she said. The words sounded as broken as she felt. Cassandra's expression remained unreadable. Yes. Genesis swallowed, her throat tight. She forced herself to ask, though she already knew the answer. So the fire was a cover-up? Yes, Cassandra confirmed smoothly. They failed, luckily for you. Genesis felt her heart beat in her throat, a tight coil of panic slithering up her spine, burrowing into her brain. Maybe. And now? Her voice barely carried across the short table. Cassandra didn't hesitate this time, didn't soften the answer. Now? You exist in a political purgatory, a gray area. A long pause. Genesis searched Cassandra's face. Nothing. Waiting. The crux of the matter is, Cassandra continued, as she The crux of the matter is, Cassandra continued, as if discussing facts on a report. As I mentioned, you're not a citizen, thus you do not legally exist. You are at the Athenaeum's mercy. My mercy. The realization crawled through her, cold and slow, a shadow, a breath, a shift in the room. Genesis felt something slip beneath the surface of her mind, something dark, something vast. She glanced back at the wall. Smooth. She forced her expression to stay neutral, forcing herself not to react. She wanted a reaction. She wouldn't give it to her. She instead met Cassandra's calculating and unyielding gaze. Don't break. There are potential paths ahead for you, if we are careful. I've been attempting to persuade the Athenaeum, but, she sighed dramatically, they have their beliefs on such matters, archaic and dangerous. She reached for the coffee, her voice turning almost conspiratorial. Of course. A slow sip, a flicker of amusement. There are some who might suggest another path entirely in this sort of gray situation. Genesis' body stiffened. A pulse of unease rolled through her, cold and instinctive. She didn't have to ask. Cassandra meant disappearing. The room felt smaller now. Genesis wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe when Cassandra had first sat down. Maybe when she'd said, you shouldn't exist. But the air had thickened, pressing against her skin. Her mind now, this. The weight of the words tightened like a noose. And then, suddenly, she leaned back and smiled. Standing, saying nothing more, Cassandra's heels clicked against the floor. The door hissed, silent, empty, alone. She stared at the space Cassandra had just vacated. It still bore the imprint of her presence, but the warmth was already fading. Her mind churned, replaying the conversation. "You're not supposed to exist." The words echoed, slow and deliberate. Was this a threat? A warning? A statement of fact? A flood of thoughts surged from the deep recesses of her mind, thoughts she had never considered before. What now? Cassandra had said that Anthony and Am hadn't made their decision yet, that her fate was still in question. That was a political gray area, but was that a lie? It was, wasn't it? They had already decided. The examination in the hospital, the interview, the careful, measured way Cassandra spoke, the way she had steered the conversation. She was here because they were deciding how to erase her, not if, maybe not even when. Her stomach twisted. She tried to exhale slowly to keep the panic from rising, but it was too late. The walls hummed. Just beneath the threshold of hearing, something shifted. She glanced round, pulse spiking. The golden light that should have been warm felt stark and sterile, too bright, pressing against her eyes like a migraine. Had it been this bright before? Genesis inhaled sharply. She felt something, an absence, a gap where something should have been. Her eyes dropped to the table, the coffee cup. It flickered once, twice, like a glitch in a recording, like a candle guttering in the wind. There, then not. She went still. Her mind screamed, "It's just your imagination," but her body knew better. It had been there. She had seen it, smelled it, tasted it. The bitterness still clinging to the back of her throat. But now, nothing. Genesis stared at the spot, throat tight, breath shallow. Had she imagined it? A slow, creeping sensation crawled up her spine, coiling around her thoughts like a snake. What else wasn't real? She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to retrace the conversation. Cassandra had been there, hadn't she? She had walked in, sat down, spoke with her, hadn't she? Genesis exhaled, pushing the thought away, but the doubt slithered, slick and sharp, deeper, insidious and unwelcome, a parasite. If the cup hadn't been there, then what about Cassandra? For one horrible second, she couldn't picture the woman's face. She had been wearing red, her hair pulled back, her glasses dark, precise, her voice cool, confident, telling her. What had they discussed? Genesis pressed her palms against her temples, closing her eyes, trying to concentrate. Had that even happened? Or had she just been sitting here the entire time, watching, waiting? Her breath caught, nausea curling in her stomach. No, that wasn't possible. Was it? She remembered the weight of Cassandra's presence, though, the pressure of her gaze, the deliberate way she spoke, the tap of her nails that seemed to still echo in the small room. But the doubt had already woven into her mind. Genesis forced her eyes open, stared down at the table. She touched the place the coffee had sat. It was still warm. Gone. It was gone. How? She glanced up. The jacket, red, vivid against the stark white room. There. She wasn't crazy. But if that was true, then what was happening? She shivered, looking at the wall. She had to move now, or she would be gone too. And that's chapter 1. Thank you for joining me. Come back to hear chapter 2.